Today I'm taking a look at a watch by a brand called Miltado, and this was a watch sent in by the brand themselves. They were just curious of what my thoughts were and wanted me to do a review, which I was going to do absolutely anyway. I do get to keep the watch, so keep that in mind, but they didn't ask to review the footage beforehand. They didn't ask that anything specific be put in the video, and these thoughts are all still my own. So let's get into the review. So we have a diameter of about 36 millimeters, lug to lug of 41.8, height of just 10.4, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Here we're gonna have the Seagull ST1701 movement beating away in here through a closed case back. It's just one of those classic Seagull movements. This one in specific beats at 21,600, which to me is not bad just because, I mean, we have a sub-second, so the quote-unquote stutter of the seconds hand isn't really noticeable. We do have a beautifully domed sapphire crystal here, if we can kind of focus in a little bit. Very gentle dome. It does have AR coating, but they don't state whether it's on the inside or the outside. There's 100 meters of stated water resistance, and honestly, it doesn't say it anywhere, which, to be fair, I prefer. But it is just a regular push-pull crown. The entire case is 316L steel, and really lastly but not least, the watch retails directly from Miltado for $129, but they have sales every now and then. Starting with the dial here, and this is beautifully done. We of course have these Breguet numerals, this Breguet handset, all done in this polished steel application, and it looks very nice. There's a nice three-dimensionality to it. The hands themselves have this rounded and curved quality, and really do capture the light really nicely. The seconds hand has a tiny little hint of blue there. It's not truly heat blue. I believe this one's more of a painted kind of application. It doesn't look too bad. Of course, I would have preferred a heat blued hand, but at $120, I mean, you can't expect the world. The dial from far away really looks like a pure porcelain white kind of dial, but to be honest, when you look up close, it has this almost, I wouldn't quite call it eggshell. It quite literally looks like if you just painted a wall in that little bit of residual paint texture. That's what is on the dial here. So we'll see it more once we zoom in, but to be honest, from wrist view, it looks pretty much perfectly flat white. We have a printed railroads track along the outboard. The sub-seconds track also is railroaded with actual concentric circling as well, so you add a little bit of a different texture to the dial. And outside that, it's just a simple clean dial. They didn't really do anything crazy here. They also didn't, thankfully, add any more text. They didn't really need it. I think the offset dial itself is already more interesting than any other text you could add to the dial to say, hey, 100 meters or whatnot. The sub-seconds itself, I think, is beautifully placed, and the fact that they didn't try to include a 3 here looks fantastic. And let's take a closer look and see how it holds up under macro. So looking up close, we do start to see that texture shine through. This is what I meant when I said it kind of looks a little bit like speckled paint, a little bit like you just painted on a drywall and, well, let it dry. Now this is what it looks like. It isn't a bad texture up close, and I don't think it looks ugly in any way. It just is an interesting texture that I didn't expect to see. Kind of almost pseudo eggshell, but a little bit more of a defined grain to it. You can see how the text is done there for the Miltado logo. It isn't my preference of like something super inky and bulbous, but it does look good and does contrast against the dial pretty nicely. Taking a second to appreciate the handset, it is very small, and to be fair, that's kind of how the original Vacheron has its handset. It doesn't seem too in proportion with the watch, in my opinion, but this one is still well done. That beautiful Breguet, the way it has that little circle point at the end, the fact that it's still bifaceted even though we have such a small handset to begin with. It's also really well finished. I don't see any really marks or scratches or dust or anything like that. It is just a nicely faceted and nicely finished handset. You even have a center pinion cap there, which is rare to see nonetheless at this price. Looking at that seconds hand, we can now finally see that concentric track that I was talking about. This is, in my opinion, pretty hard to see from the wrist, and a detail that I think goes unnoticed, unfortunately. The text on the seconds track is done very well. The hand itself is actually blued pretty nicely and isn't finished that bad. So, I mean, not many things to complain about here. Taking a look at the numerals themselves, they have this beautiful roundedness to them. They capture the light amazingly. They are also just finished nicely. There isn't really a lot of QC issues with the markers themselves. You can see there, however, there's like a little fiber hiding under the base of that one there. So that is unfortunate to see, but it is just one of those QC things that we see when we're talking about pieces of this price point. I honestly have never noticed it from a wrist view, and it doesn't really affect my wearing experience, but especially if you zoomed in on this level and realized it's there, you probably won't be able to quote unquote unsee it. Outside of that, I think the numerals are actually finished amazingly well. The seconds track is done well. The actual handset is done well. So there isn't really a lot to fault this dial on, especially not under macro, which is kind of where a lot of the faults would come and kind of bear their face. But here, it still holds up pretty well. So taking a look at the watch in natural light, you can see in direct sunlight, it still is a very nice pure white dial. The actual indices and the hands don't really have any dual nature about them. They just kind of look like this silverish gray. They don't go light or dark. To me, the viewing angles are fantastic. There isn't really any distortion from the dome, and it's a good looking watch in sunlight. Moving to the shade, we now get a little bit more light play. The markers go from light to dark as they catch the light and catch, whatever shadows they can as well. The hands do the same. The faceting on the hands really stands out. And the watch, I think, just comes to life a little bit more. The white's not as bright. It's not as in your face either in shaded light too, which I think is just really nice. The case also just catches the light beautifully. It brings it up and over and around the case, leads your eye into the dial most of the time, and it's just a pleasure to look at. And kind of just on the wrist outside, I mean, to me, it looks fantastic in both lighting situations. Here, the bright light makes you focus on the dial a little bit more, whereas the kind of shaded light makes you focus on all the other finishing elements of the case, the hands, the indices, just about everything else that's not the dial, to be honest. So moving on to the case of this watch, and this is fantastically done. It is relatively thin, especially with how it wears onto the wrist. It doesn't have a very large case back either. It has a little bit of like rounded curvature to it as well, so it does just feel very comfortable. It doesn't dig in really any way. The watch itself is fully high polished. There aren't really any brush surfaces anywhere at all. That, I think, overall is a benefit. It feels very well polished. It doesn't look like a cheap finish at any point. So the way that you get these reflections back at you, especially since the entire top of this case is curved and just angled away from you, the way it captures the light and just plays with it looks really premium. Classic for this kind of style of watch. We have really short lugs, and it's one of those things where you basically either need curved lug bars, a strap with a pretty thin end here, or you're just jamming straps in there and they might become quote unquote damaged by becoming a little bit curved over time, and then they maybe won't look as good over time on regular straps with regular lugs. So that's just something to keep in mind. Either buy watch straps that are meant to only go on this watch, or be ready to lose a watch strap to only being able to be wearing it on this watch. The crown is of course in a weird position. It's not the most terrible to wind, especially if you get a good purchase on it. Like, I'm winding it pretty easily right now. It's not the best sounding wind in the world, but it's also not the worst feeling either. It just is a kind of nice little regular ratchety kind of winding feeling, but the sound is a little off-putting. A little rough, a little harsh. It is what it is. You can't have the world. The actual setting and manipulation of the crown, however, is perfect. The hands are super smooth. It feels very comfortable, and there's not really any negative I can say about that operation. I do maybe wish the crown was a hair thicker, just to have a little bit better knurling, make it a little bit easier for some people to grip that, but as it is, it's probably the best it can be for operation at that angle. Of course, we have the faux bolted / screwed style lugs here. This is not true. It just takes a traditional spring bar. This one is not the original strap. To be quite honest, I lost the original, but it was nothing to write home about. Just one of those original genuine leather straps that are pretty terrible, and most of the money is going into the watch here, the dial, the finishing, rather than the strap. The strap's very much an afterthought, but you can pick up a great strap for 20 bucks and make it a killer package. So moving on to how this watch wears on wrist, I was wearing the basically brother to this, which is the 38mm by Baltony. A little bit larger, different handset, different dial finish, and you'll definitely see how different those shapes wear. And then we have the Miltado on my 6.5-inch wrist. And as you can see, at least for me personally, this does look a lot more proportional than the Baltony did. This would be my preferred size for this case shape. Very classic, super traditional, really comfortable. Again, not thick, not harsh, not really sharp in any angle. So it's a super well wearing, super comfortable case shape on wrist. And especially at this 36mm size, it feels right. Feels elegant, absolutely can be a dress watch. And one of those things too where if I move the watch up, I have closer to around a 6-inch wrist here, and it's still completely proportional. Those short lugs really help it wear on pretty much any wrist. It really doesn't rise up off the wrist at all. It still is very comfortable. And it is one of those things where it doesn't really appear thick at really any angle. It's super comfortable. It's never felt misproportioned to me. And overall, I really just have no complaints with the overall wearing experience of this watch. So as you can see there, the case starts to dig into the strap and kind of, in a sense ruin it, especially when you have a textured strap like this. You can maybe bring it back to life just a little bit, but it's one of those things where if you wear it on that one strap long enough, it'll probably kind of ruin the strap beyond repair in a sense. So here we have a nice gray strap. This one is from Has No Bounds. Although this is a straight end strap, it is one of those ones where it's relatively thin on the ends here. It doesn't bunch up with a bunch of fabric. So it can be worn. It does take a little bit of effort to squeeze it into the lug holes, but it is what it is. To be fair, once it's on, it looks pretty good. It looks cohesive. It feels nice. It complements the gray of the actual numerals themselves. So it is a good looking strap, but just a little unfortunate you have to squeeze it and ruin it just a bit to get it in there. Here's another very cool has no bound strap. I think this is called Bisano leather, something similar to that. It has this almost foil color shift into it, which I think is pretty cool. And it's one of those things where it gives the watch a more vintage, aged kind of look. The watch itself is bright and shiny, but the watch strap kind of has a little bit of life, a little bit of sheen, and a little bit of almost kind of rustic nature about it from those darker and lighter spots. To me, this looks fantastic, adds some gray tones that weren't there otherwise. Adds pop of fun to the watch that wouldn't have been there when you go with more serious straps like this previous gray one. To me, it just looks great, and they do this in a lot of different colors, so really, you can have a lot of fun. This is one of the few curved lug bar straps that I actually have. This is from Veblenist. Beautiful strap, and this fits in perfectly well. It doesn't take any finagling to actually get into those lugs. It slots right in perfectly. So this watch is really made for those curved lug bars. So let's get it on. Looks pretty good. Nice little warm tone to add to the watch that otherwise wouldn't have been there. A little brighter on the watch too. And it's hard to kind of capture on camera, and I wouldn't really call it bunching up of a material, but you get this area where the curved portion of the strap actually faces up towards you. So it's a little bit of a weird aesthetic, I think personally. That's probably just due to the lugs being so short. The strap doesn't really have any other place to go. But with that being said, I do still think it's a pretty good package. Now, if you want to avoid the whole spring bar lug situation altogether, you can go for very thin single pass straps. If you have a NATO that's a little on the thicker side, it definitely won't fit. But something like this, a Perlon, really super thin, it's going to fit. It's not going to really add bulk to the watch, and thankfully able to squeeze between those lug holes. I think a Perlon's a great option. It adds this color that wouldn't have otherwise been there. They do a lot of fun textures. This one specifically, I think, is honestly just from cheapest NATO strap, so it's a pretty cool little grayish, whitish, blackish weave. And to me, pairs with the watch nicely. It wears comfortably. It doesn't kind of sit weirdly or look out of place, in my opinion. It just does wear nicely. And lastly, we'll do the black silicone NATO, just because, again, super thin. It's going to wear well on the watch. And again, one of the very few things that can fit between that very tight spacing. To me, that honestly looks fantastic. It adds this little bit of sportiness that wouldn't have been there otherwise. Because the strap has a wider stance, it's 20mm untapered, it pairs, I think, really well with this more square-ish style cases, which have more surface area, they have a larger stance on wrist, and it's just, I think, complemented well by this strap. So pros and cons of this watch, and one of the biggest pros for me is going to be the size here. At 36mm, this is a thing we just don't see a lot, a 36mm cushion case watch. I have legitimately been on the search for a couple years for something in this size, and I've bought a lot of random stuff because of it, and nothing has been quite like this. Nothing has been the right size and the right shape that I've liked. So it's really nice to see something like this. I think it's gonna be very comfortable for a lot of people. It's a cool dress case. I think it looks good on a lot of people's wrists, and it's just nice to have this at this size format. Another big pro for the watch is going to be that it is finished well. The markers pop, the hands pop, the way the case is angled all around and very curvaceous, and the way it catches the light because that gradual curve. It just looks good, and it looks premium. It looks more expensive than you would expect for the price, absolutely. And it absolutely is on par, if not better, than things that are 2 to 3 times the price point. For example, an Orient Bambino or the Tissot Viso Date, things like that. This can absolutely hold a candle to. And kind of following on from that point, this is great value. You're talking about $129 full retail. They probably will have sales at some point. Even right now, you can get $5 off, and it becomes $125 basically. It's one of those things where there's not much else you can get out here for this price point that is going to be this good and feel this good in person. Sure, there's other AliExpress watches, and those can be hit or miss, and they can be very nice, but something where you know what you're getting, it's finished well, it looks good in person. The only thing you're really gonna have to replace is the strap. Now, moving on to cons, and one of the biggest cons for me is the strap, and not necessarily the original strap it came with, which also wasn't good, but it's more of the fact that at the end of the day, you kind of have to use curved lug bars, you have to use curved watch straps, and it's one of those things where not a lot of people just have those lying around. It has to be super custom for the most part. You have to order special straps or new straps. and it's annoying and it's expensive to do. So it's a little bit unfortunate that this watch is so affordable and so good value, and they just couldn't make the lugs a little bit longer, something like that, to accommodate a normal strap. Another big con for me is the hands on the case are just a little bit small, or the hands on the watch face rather. To me, it does look pretty similarly sized to the actual Vacheron that this is homaging. That being said, I still don't like the size. I do think they should be a smidgen bigger. Maybe they should go for a different handset. At the end of the day, it still is readable and still looks good, but I do think it can be better and more proportional in my opinion. Another small thing is I do think the watch can be a little bit loud. I'll kind of move it around the mic there. And it's just one of those things where you do hear it throughout the day, certain little hand movements, you'll end up hearing the watch movement, especially if you're in a dead quiet room. So it's not the quietest movement. I'll probably potentially, play with maybe just taking the rotor off and using it as a quick and dirty manual wind. That could be an option that fixes that. But as it stands, if you buy it and you don't want to play around with it, this is going to be a little bit on the louder side. And my last con really is the fact that this is a well-made watch, and I don't think they had to go so far into the homage territory that they did. If they would have just made a cushion case watch at this size with these dimensions, with a similar amount of finishing but a completely different dial, it still would have been a fantastic watch. Maybe not as many people would have bought it because it doesn't look like something else, but there are just so many good elements here. Even if you had still kept that homage kind of route, but just not made it tilted and driver-esque, if you just kept it as a normal, quote-unquote, front-facing watch, put the crown at 3 so it's actually easier to access, put the sub-seconds down at 6 because that's just where it would be naturally, and it still would look good, and it would pay homage a little bit without being a direct copy. At the end of the day, they took the easy route. Does it still look good? Yes. Will I still probably wear it? Absolutely. But to me, it also would be just nice to see something that's not hitting the nail on the head so much. But final thoughts, and I did really like this watch. Again, just like the Baltony I previously reviewed, this is well finished. It's an amazing case. It's comfortable. It wears well. And like I said, for your money, there's not a lot of better things out there. It is a really nice looking watch, especially if you're someone like me who's into dress watches. It's a fantastic size, it wears amazingly, it just, I think, looks good on the wrist, it can slide under a cuff. If you put it on a rubber strap like the rubber NATO I had on earlier, supposedly it has 100 meters of water resistance. How much do I trust that? I'm not sure. But in theory, this is a do anything kind of watch, which is cool. You're getting an automatic watch, you're getting a great case shape, you're getting something that's relatively well finished, and to be honest, in most lighting situations and most times you're looking at the watch, looks very, very premium. I think there's very few cases you'll be disappointed by this watch unless you just buy one and it just blatantly doesn't work. I think if you buy one from the Miltado website, they do offer a 2-year warranty, so that's something you could maybe put your trust in and say, hey, the watch doesn't work, can I get a replacement, something like that. Hopefully they would be on your side with that. So it's at least a little safer than buying directly from something like AliExpress and going, I don't know how I'm gonna ship this back to China, or how am I gonna ship this to their, whoever, and do they even accept returns or whatnot, and how do I go about a warranty repair? But outside that, if you're looking at a kind of easy, no frills dress watch, something that, looks the part, but you don't have to break the bank on, this is absolutely a great option. This is basically half the price of a Bambino from Orient directly. That says something. This has sapphire, the Bambino doesn't. This actually wears better. This is a little smaller, but it doesn't feel super small because it's square, so it's kind of like a 38. There's a lot going for this watch that I love personally, and I think if you're even dipping your toes into dress watches, this would be a great option because it's unique and it's fun, and it kind of shows you what a dress watch can give you that a sports watch really doesn't. It gives you that finishing aspect, it gives you that unique case shape, it gives you that sizing, and I think at around $100 give or take, it's a great way to try it out. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. As always, just if you have any questions, leave them down below. More than happy to answer, and thank you as always for watching. Hope you got something out of it, and I will see you in another one.